I'm going to go through this fairly quickly, and what I'm going to do is kind of start big picture and tell you what we're doing with our pathways assessment. Then I'm going to drill down a bit, and hopefully we'll have enough time to go through some of the specifics with conclusions that we've, at least interim conclusions or initial conclusions that we've reached on one of the potential pathway groups. So let me make sure I can do this. So what we're doing is really taking a step back and trying to take an objective, step-by-step look at potential pathways for exotic swine pathogens to come into the U.S. and then spread in the U.S. and cause problems. So we're not looking at any specific viruses. We're not looking at specific countries. This really is, it's a very, very broad assessment. We are trying to go through it stepwise, and that's some of what I'll explain here. So the first step in this assessment is what we call an entry assessment. So that's looking at the potential for these viruses to come into the U.S. So with the entry assessment, our objectives are two. First of all, to identify and describe pathways by which these pathogens may enter the U.S. And then second objective is to estimate the likelihood that any of those pathways may introduce pathogens. Don't know if y'all can really read this. Yeah, that comes across fairly clearly. Anyway, this is the step-by-step process for a virus to enter the U.S. So you start off up at the top there. I don't have a pointer, so use a finger. So is a virus present in a region of another country? Yes, then you move to the next step. So that next step then is that an infected or a contaminated product is selected for export. Now keep in mind here we're looking at all pathways. So this could be a live animal, it could be a highly processed product. So that's the next step. And with any of these, if there's no potential there, clearly you roll off here and there's no opportunity for entry. But so let's follow down and say, yes, there is that potential for that product to be infected or contaminated. Next step is the virus survives any process prior to export. So if you have something that has a pretty significant heating process, is the virus going to survive that? If no, you kick it out. If yes, you move on. Now with this one, we do note over here, you always have a potential for contamination post-process. So you could have a pretty significant process that's going to inactivate whatever virus, but if you aren't controlling post-production practices, you could have that potential, which kicks you back into the rest of the stream. So the next step is that virus that has survived all of this so far then survives transport to the U.S. And with some of these products, these are really harsh conditions for a virus to survive. So you've got an industrially produced feed ingredient with no animal products in it. Let's say that stuff is put in a plastic bag, some type of a tote or container, and it's loaded onto transport within the country, then it's loaded into a container, put in a container ship, comes to the U.S., further transport. So you've got very dry conditions to start with. You've got long periods of time for transport, again, in pretty harsh conditions. So is a virus going to survive that? This last one down here, so this virus survives all of that so far. Will the virus survive any import mitigations at the border? So for certain products, if we're doing inspections, if we're looking for certification, for permits, if we catch something there, we can always kick it out there. So if the virus survives all of that, then down here that you can't read in the red is entry. So those are all the steps that we're looking through for each of these potential pathways. Now, as I said, right now and what I just outlined, that's the entry assessment. That's one part of the overall pathways assessment. So once we do the entry assessment, then we'll move into these next steps. So those are, first of all, any of these pathways that we identify that has a non-negligible likelihood of introduction, then we'll look at the potential for exposure within the U.S. So if this is some product that could have the potential for introduction, but it doesn't have any potential to come into contact with swine in the U.S., then not a problem. But if we do have some, after we do that exposure that has non-negligible likelihood of exposure, then we look at consequences. So if it comes in and is exposed to swine, but it's not causing disease, not causing problems, consequences aren't great. That last step here, and this then is going to be probably the hardest step, any of these pathways where all of the above, both introduction, exposure, and consequence are non-negligible, then we start to talk about potential mitigation measures. And, you know, mitigation measures, it's an easy concept to grasp, but then looking at those measures and considering pros and cons and commercial liability, et cetera, can be really challenging. So we'll see where we get there. Brief summary of the terms that we're using in this document. These are fairly standard understanding of risk estimation terms. Clearly, these are qualitative terms, not quantitative in any way, shape, or form. So negligible, generally that means it's so rare that it doesn't merit consideration. Low is it's rare, but it can occur. Medium risk means it occurs regularly, and a high risk would occur very often. Now, for any of these types of analyses, clearly you make some assumptions. If you've got a more focused analysis, you can make some probably better assumptions. But for purposes of this one, we went very broad, and we tended to, in some instances, make worst-case assumptions, and others perhaps not. So we went ahead and assumed that in any given country, region, whatever, one or more exotic viral pathogens are present. We also assumed that infected animals are selected or have the potential to be selected for slaughter and or rendering. So there is the possibility for virus to get into those types of animal-derived products. And we also assumed that current regulations and mitigation procedures are effectively enforced, either in the country of origin or like our import controls at our border. Now, we did come up with a very long list of viruses. Clearly, we can't go through and analyze all of these steps for all of these viruses. So we tried to choose a representative set. We picked 3 viruses that we hope to have them stand in for all of the other viruses. The 3 viruses that we picked do have a range of resistance to inactivation. They also are ones that there does tend to be some literature out there, so we can use that literature to help influence our arguments or support our arguments, however the case may be. So those 3 that we picked were classical swine fever, foot-and-mouth disease, and pseudorabies. For our entry assessment, we have lumped things into what we called potential pathway groups. So we tried to put things together into logical groups that may have some type of similar treatment or some type of similar derivation. So very broad groups, but we started off with airborne, that is a potential pathway. Next big group are inanimate articles that could serve as fomites. And now in each of these big groups, then we'll break it down, and as I go through the feed part of it, you'll see kind of what I mean there. But inanimate articles, so that could be animal tissues or fluid and their products, conveyances and containers, equipment, this is such stuff as used farm equipment, veterinary equipment, those types of things, food and feed, garbage. We deal a lot with regulated garbage. Not everybody recognizes that, but that is definitely a possibility for exposure. Live animals that may serve as vectors or fomites are the other big group. So clearly that would be livestock and their germplasm. Humans, we are animals, so we fall into that category. Microorganisms or arthropod vectors, and then other live animals. So the other live animals there would be things like rodents that might be on a ship, those types of other animals. So let's take a closer look at what we've done so far with the feed group So this is one little subset there, right there. And this will then give you an idea kind of what we'll be looking at for the entire entry assessment. So when we looked at feed ingredients, we broke this down further. And we felt like we could break these down into animal-derived products. So this would be rendered products, marine products like fish meal, fish guts, dairy products, etc. Then you've got plant products, forage, grain, byproducts, fats, lots of stuff. Those things that are created from a microbial culture, certain amino acids, minerals, vitamins. Those things that are mined, again, minerals, anti-caking agents, those types of things, and synthetic or chemically synthesized ingredients, amino acids, minerals, vitamins. So we'll start off with the animal-derived products group. So this primarily includes rendered animal proteins and fats and marine byproducts. Now, as we went through this entry assessment, we did pull data from customs database, which if anybody's worked with the customs data, it gives you a pretty good picture overall, but if you want to get down into details about any individual shipment, there's lots of errors in that data. But it can give you a real good idea of what's coming in from where. It's also a challenge to deal with because you have to drill down into the harmonized tariff schedule, the HS codes of different products, which in some instances can be really specific, and in other instances it can be really broad. So it's interesting data to interpret. But we did go ahead and pull that just so we could see what's coming in. So on this one, we do include blood products, which would be blood meal, plasma, anything like that would fall into this type of category. Actually, the trade data show that none of those were imported. I'd also note that we do issue import permits generally especially for spray-dried plasma, and we don't currently have any existing commercial permits. Clearly we have some for research institutions, but nothing for commercial. But as we went through then looking at other rendered proteins and fats, marine byproducts, our assumption here and what the literature shows is in general a rendering process is going to inactivate most virus. Now clearly you could have post-processing contamination, but in a trade arena we assumed then that post-processing contamination is unlikely. And also, again, that transport times and conditions aren't conducive to virus survival. So again, is that virus going to live for a 3-month transport period in containers, whatever? Overall, then, negligible risk of entry through any of these types of products.
Lisa, do we have rendered products coming in from overseas and from positive companies? I mean, positive countries?
We do. And I can find the right. Actually, while I'm looking, anybody that really wants to help us out and is interested in contributing to our assessment, please let me know. I'd be glad to send you a draft of where we are currently. We want this definitely to be a collaborative process. So if folks have additional information, we are more than open to that. So just a summary here of imported animal-derived feed ingredients, which would include the rendered stuff. So animal feed preparations, excluding pet food, because pet food's a big thing. Mixed swine feeds, these are coming from Canada, Nigeria, China, Malaysia, Germany, Mexico. Bones and horn cores, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Brazil. Fats, Canada primarily. Flours, meals, pellets of meat or meat offal, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. Other animal fats and inedible mixtures, Brazil, Panama, Mexico, China, India. Other animal products not intended for animal feed, not otherwise specified, Canada, China, Mexico. And pretty significant quantities. So, yeah, this stuff is coming in.
Is there any testing done on anything? As far as just accepting that this is properly rendered?
At this point in time, there is no testing done on that. the way APHIS's import regulations are set up, our assumption is that a rendering process is going to inactivate most viruses. Now, we've got some TSE-related restrictions, which I won't go into here, but our assumption traditionally has been that. So if product comes in, used to be our PPQ guys, but now it's CBP folks looking at that, and it looks like, yes, it's rendered meal. On it comes in. So, next big group here would be milk and milk derivatives. Relatively small amount of imports of these, but they do come in. Some of this is coming in from countries that we consider affected with FMD, so we do require treatment sufficient to inactivate FMD. Any type of a drying process, you get to a certain heat level, then would meet that. Again, with these, post-processing contamination we assumed was unlikely, and the transport conditions harsh again, so negligible risk of entry for these. Animal manure. And in this instance, we were just looking at animal manure as a feed ingredient. We will also look at manure in those other pathways, stuff that comes in like dried poop pots, whatever those things are. We'll look at that separately, but just for feed, because we know that is a possibility. We assumed virus could be present, but we do not allow in manure for purpose of feeding, so it's not coming in, negligible risk of entry.
Is animal manure fed to like the aquaculture in China, and those fish are imported over here? So can animal manure be fed to Chinese aquaculture, and we end up with flopping here from China?
That's a good question. Yeah. We didn't look at that specific question in that specific instance because what we were looking at was the manure itself coming in.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm sure they're using it as a nutrient source.
Yeah. Yeah.
Aquaculture is a big thing now.
Yep. 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 So good point. We'll definitely look at that. Okay, plants and plant products. There are a lot of imports of various plants and plant products, primarily Canada, Argentina, and Mexico. Potential here for contamination if those types of things have contact with infected animals, their excretions. We do have requirements in place because in the literature there are citations about foot and mouth disease virus coming in on hay and straw. So we have mitigations. Most countries around the world have mitigations for those types of products. If it's heat-treated, pelleted, those regs are in place to address potential for FMD. So, but it's unknown with many of these other viruses. What is the virus survival time on a plant product, on some type of a plant meal? That's a big unknown question. So with unknowns like that, tentative conclusion here, negligible risk of entry if these types of things are pelleted or treated, because you have a heat treatment process that will tend to inactivate the virus. Low risk of entry if they are unprocessed. Those things are created by microbial culture. So these would be such things as some of the amino acids, probiotics, enzymes, some of the B vitamins. These are generally done through an industrial type process, and contamination of that culture usually is considered a production failure. Anything in that type of a process would have some type of GMP control, so they're looking out for that. In addition, though, after you've created that product through the culture, you're going through additional processing steps to recover the product that you've created. So those also would then not be conducive to virus survival. So our conclusion here was negligible risk of entry for those. Chemical synthesis and or mining. So these include, again, more amino acids, minerals, vitamins here is a big one. A lot of these vitamins are chemically synthesized. Again, no animal products in these processes, but if there was some, contamination would be unlikely to survive the manufacturing process. And we're assuming, again, since these are industrial processes, post-processing contamination unlikely, and harsh transport conditions, so negligible risk of entry. So that's starting up at the big picture with what we're doing with the analysis and a few specifics so you can see how we're working through the process on feed. As I said, if anybody really wants a copy of the draft where we are, please see me afterwards. I'd be glad to get that to you. As folks have additional information to feed in there, we're really looking for that.
This is D.
I'm privy to Homeland Security information in Texas, and they interdicted hundreds of Chinese, Russian, Albanian, Arabian, Indian, Pakistani people walking into the United States through Texas every week. Every week, that's ones they catch. So my question is, when y'all did the initial epidemiology on the very first few commercial places that had PED, did y'all survey, did you look at the workers there to see if there's the possibility of foreign nationals that were employed there?
Yeah, we asked questions all about, have you had visitors on your farm? Have your employees been traveled? Those kinds of things. So yeah, it was a pretty thorough
All right, good.
analysis.